Hey there, welcome back to TBH Video Journal. I'm Michael Middleton. Thank you for joining me. In today's episode, we're going to take this doe that I just shot this evening and we're going to stuff her in a jar. Stay tuned. I shot this doe this evening. It was kind of last light. I didn't get really good video, but I thought this would be a perfect opportunity to use this deer, show you how I go about canning some meat and why I might go about canning some meat. So anyway, let me get her skin quartered, cleaned up, and we'll meet you back over in the kitchen in the cabin. All right, so here we are in the lab, and as promised, we're going to can some meat. We're going to can that doe that I shot. I got her skin and I quartered her up, broke her down just like I showed in the last video. If you haven't seen that, I'll post a link to it right here, and that is basically how to break down into separate muscle groups all of the different muscles of the deer. And so I went ahead and bagged those, and now here we are back ready to can it. So I don't want to do a comprehensive how to can meat. There's a lot of different videos on that. It gets into real details and specific, but I do want to kind of go over the basics of how I do it, and there are different ways to do it, and then kind of answer some questions that you as a first timer might have, the same questions that I had before I started canning meat, and there's a whole lot of questions that it had. Okay, so before we really get started, let me talk about some of the things that you're going to need in order to can. The first, obviously, being a pressure canner. Now, if you're going to can meat, this is very important, probably the most important part, you need to have a pressure canner. Pressure canner is not necessarily the same as a pressure cooker, although a pressure canner can often be a pressure cooker as well. But you don't want to water bath meat. Anything with low acid foods, you don't want to water bath. That's reserved for anything high acidic foods like tomatoes and pickles and jams and jellies. You can water bath can, but if you're canning meat, you must have a pressure canner. Now, there are different types of pressure canners available. There's a couple of different popular models. One, and probably the most popular model, is the All-American canner, and it doesn't have a rubber O-ring in it. If you can see that, sorry my water's warmed up here, but it is a metal on metal seal. The one that I have here is a Presto 23 quart canner. The All-American canner is a great canner. I would love to have that one, but it's about $250 to $300 depending on which model you get and where you buy it from, of course. I got this one, I think, for under $90, maybe even under $80 from Walmart.com, I believe. So I've used this one. It works really well, does exactly what I need it to do. I've done several batches already. So in addition to pressure canner, the other things that you're going to need are obviously jars. And you can get jars in a variety of different sizes, different types. This is quart jar. These are both quart jars. One of them is a wide mouth jar and the other is a narrow mouth jar. Typically for canning meat, I prefer the wide mouth jar. That allows me easier access to get the food in and out of there. If you're going to be doing liquids, then maybe a narrow mouth jar would be adequate. So I have my quart jars, also have a pint jar, and I've actually gotten to where I prefer to can meat in pints because it's a smaller serving size. We have 3 people in our house that I'm cooking for. Typically a pint jar works well. And then I actually do some stuff for individual servings in half pint jars. And so I use this frequently just for individual servings, and I'll talk more about when I get into the whys of canning here shortly. When you buy the jars, whether you buy the Ball or the Kerr or whatever brand that you buy, and I would suggest sticking with a good quality jar like Ball or Kerr, when you buy those, they're going to come with the rings and the lids, but you can also buy your lids and rings separately. Typically you can reuse your jars. It's absolutely no problem to reuse your jars. They don't recommend reusing the lids, and I actually do reuse lids from time to time as long as they're good quality. I check the seal on them, make sure there's no damage to the seal, make sure there's no damage to the outside of the ring. It's recommended that you use new lids every time. As far as the rings go, I reuse the rings, and I actually store the canned meat without the rings on them because the rings tend to rust. You can get a false seal. So storing them without the rings on them actually helps to identify and make sure that you've got a proper seal on them. Okay, so other things that you're going to need is I've got a funnel, and this is important so that you can put whatever you're putting in your jars without getting grease and salt and all that stuff around the rim of the jar, which can prevent a good seal. I've got a jar lifter, which is another important item when you're lifting the jars out of the hot the canner. You definitely want to make sure you have one of those. And then of course I've got, what came with it, kind of came as a kit, I've got a little plastic piece that helps get the air out from around the inside, depending on what you're canning. If you're canning vegetables and so forth, it's not that critical with the meat. It also has on it, you want to leave head space in your jars, and so it's got different measurements. And you see it's step measurements for whatever head space that you want to leave. The other thing that I have is that I actually don't use that much, and that is a lid lifter. It's often recommended, especially with water bath canning, that you sterilize or at least warm up your lids. And so reaching in to get the lids out of the hot water, you can of course scald yourself. The lid lifter is metallic, and it just helps you lift that lid up without the risk of burning yourself, and then just set those back down on the jars. The other items that we have here is I actually have a couple of different, move that out of the way, a couple of different jar separators. Now one will go on the bottom of the pressure canner, and that's the first layer. You don't want your jars sitting on the bottom where the highest heat is, or you'll risk cracking them. So this provides just a little bit, and we'll set that down in first. We'll put some whatever the amount of water that your pressure canner calls for. We'll put our jars in, and then depending on which canner you have, for example, if I'm going to do pint jars, I can stack those jars in here, and so this will just go on top of the jars, and then I can stack. So it just creates a separation between your jars when you're stacking them. So I think the canner that I have, this Presto, came with one of them, and I ordered a second one to have available so that I could stack my jars. And I think I can fit actually a quart and then stack on top of that pint jars as well. One thing that I would recommend if you're canning is to go to the National Center for Home Preservation website, and it has detailed information on the proper method for canning whatever it is that you're canning, whether it's venison or beef or pork or pickles or vegetables or jams, jellies, whatever. Also check with your manufacturer, getting back to the weight. Depending on what altitude you're at is going to depend on what pressure that you want to can at. I prefer to do a raw pack method of canning, which raw pack method is simply the meat goes into the jar. I do add a little bit of kosher salt to mine. You want to use a non-iodized salt, so don't use table salt. Really, the only thing that the salt is going to do is add flavor. You don't need it for preservation purposes. It's going to add flavor. The reason they don't recommend using iodized salt is because it will cloud up your jars with the liquid. I've got vinegar as well. Vinegar is going to be two purposes. One is I'm going to use it with a towel to clean the rims to make sure that there's no salt, no meat, no fat, anything that will prevent it from sealing. And the other part is I'm going to pour a little bit into the water that I have in order to keep the jars, again, the outside of the jars from becoming cloudy because of the minerals that are in the water that you have. We have a high mineral content with our water, so I want to make sure that I use the vinegar to keep the outside of my jars from clouding up. All right, so basically what I did, I've already kind of taken the steps ahead, is I took the meat, I cubed it up. Again, I used neck meat for this instance, but you can use any of the cuts that we talked about before. You can use your top round, your bottom round, your eye of round, really any cut of meat. The better the cut of meat, obviously, the better your result is going to be when it comes time to eat it. So I chopped it up, cubed it into I use probably inch and a half cubes. It doesn't really matter how big or how small you cube your meat, as long as it'll fit in the jar. Now, and typically the smaller you cube it up, the more volume you're going to be able to get into the jar. What I've done is I put the meat in here. I went ahead and took the salt. I added a half teaspoon of salt to these pints. I think it's a teaspoon for the quart, half a teaspoon for the pints. I just went ahead and poured that on top of it. I took a rag and I wiped off the rims like we talked about, and then I set my lids on and then screwed the rings on, and that's pretty much it. So I've got the last one here. I'll go ahead and do that. Reach behind me and grab a ring And then you want to make sure that you seal your rings. Just make sure they're on there good, that there's a good seal. You don't want to over tighten it, because when you pressure can it, the pressure is going to actually release from inside the jar. And so what you want to do is just kind of finger tighten it. You don't want it overly tightened. And then I went through and with my marker, probably best done afterwards, but I'm going to go ahead and do it now. And I'm going to go ahead and label it with what I've got in here, which is venison, and the date I'm just going to put February of 2018. Alright, and that's pretty much it. Now you can add whatever seasonings that you want to it. I prefer, again, kind of to keep it simple. I want to season as I prepare the meal, and so it gives me more flexibility if I don't already have it pre-seasoned. Again, I do add a little bit of salt, that's for flavor, but then I can season it as I cook it depending on what I want to cook. I'm not limited to what I can prepare based on how I seasoned it before I canned it. Alright, so then what we're going to do is we're just going to take our pressure canner. I'm going to put the lid over here. I'm going to put separator down, and then I'm just going to very carefully put these in here. And you want to be careful not to have your water too hot. If you've got cold meat in a cold jar, you don't want to crack your jars. I've warmed up the water to kind of get a head start, but it's not overly hot. And then I'm just going to set those down inside the canner, around in a ring. Alright, so that 8 jars fits perfectly in there. I'm not going to double stack them this time, but if I was, I would go ahead and put my other separator on, put it down there gently, and then I could put additional jars on top of that. But I'm not going to do that this time, just for demonstration purposes. Alright, so then I'm going to take my lid and put it back on, and make sure I seal it up and lock it in. Alright, and then what I can do, let me get this out of the way. I'm going to start up my burner here and get the water up to temperature. Now what I want to do is I want to let this start steaming. I don't want to put my weight on it just yet. I want to let steam start coming out of there, and then once steam starts coming out of there, I want to let that happen for 10 minutes before I put my weight on it to start building up pressure. You want to go ahead and get all of the air out of there and let that steam kind of come out. So you'll be able to see the white steam coming out, and allow that to set for 10 minutes before you put your weight on. Alright, so while we wait on that, let's talk about why you might want to can. And there's different reasons for why people may want to can. When I first started reading about canning, honestly I thought it was something that preppers did to store food for a long period of time in case of an emergency, and that is certainly a good reason, but there are additional reasons as well. Now you look at a can of venison, and that actually it's venison, it's in its own, cooked in its own juice, and it actually doesn't look all that appetizing, but it actually is really good. You can do a whole lot of different things with it from a recipe standpoint. Obviously emergency preparedness is one reason why you want to can. People will store venison in case of either of some sort of a disaster, whether that's man-made disaster or a natural disaster, such as hurricanes, earthquakes, anything that may leave you without power for an extended period of time. One of the reasons that I kind of started looking into it is when Hurricane Harvey came through, we were without power for 36 hours. It could have actually been much longer than that, because there were so many different people all up and down the Texas coast that were without power. We were fortunate we got ours back on 36 hours later. We actually had a generator, which helped. We were able to keep our refrigerator and our freezers and kind of the necessities going, but it made me start thinking, what if I had lost all of the meat that was in my freezer? What if all of that meat had started thawing out? I wanted to make sure that I had some way to preserve that so that I didn't just have to throw it all away. Number one, I want to can some kind of as a backup so that we have something to go to without having to go to the freezer. If the power had been out for an extended time, at some point our freezer runs out, I want to make sure that we were stocked up with a little bit for a little bit longer term storage. The other thing is, again, I wanted to know how to do it, have the equipment and the knowledge to do it, so that if my freezer started thawing out, at some point it's not efficient to either run the generator, or if you remember, there was a gas shortage, and so being able to continue to run my generator for an extended period of time would have been almost impossible. So in order to keep that meat from ruining, worst case, I'm going to go, and if I have an event like that, or if my freezer goes out, or if the power goes out, or for whatever reason the meat starts thawing, I'm going to be prepared, have the knowledge to go ahead and can that up. Now that brings one of the questions that I had. Are you able to can previously frozen meat? And the answer is yes. You can take the meat. In fact, this is what I did here. I put it all in the freezer until I got ready to sit down and do all of this. I pulled it out of the freezer, let it thaw out, cut it into chunks, and then put it in here, and we're going to can it. So yes, you can. You can take previously frozen meat. Obviously, if it's already freezer burned, you don't want to do that, but you can take any previously frozen good meat, cut it up, can it, and let it sit on the shelf. Okay, so another reason that you might want to can is for long-term storage. You know, there's an economical advantage to it. The longer you keep your meat in the freezer, there's a cost to running the freezer. Freezers are expensive. We've shot a lot of deer this year between my family, between my wife, my daughters, me. We've got a lot of animals. We're out of freezer space. So my option is to either go buy another freezer, give it away, or can it, and then we can store it on a shelf in a cool, dry place. The other economical advantage of canning meat is if you go to a grocery store and they have, say, chicken thighs on sale, or they have pork butts on sale, or whatever meat that you like, you can take advantage of those sales, stock up on it, can it, and then you can preserve it. Whereas if you don't have the freezer space, or you're not able to can it, you may not be able to take advantage of buying in bulk and taking advantage of some of those sales. You know, for example, I picked up some pork butts at $1 a pound, cut a couple of them up, put them in jars, and it is absolutely fantastic. Now, it won't rival my smoked pork butt barbecue, but to make a quick meal with it, it's actually absolutely fantastic. So you can see, I don't know if you can tell it on the camera, but there's a constant steady stream of white steam coming out of that vent hole. And so I'm going to start my 10-minute timer now, and so in about 10 minutes we'll go ahead and put the weight on there. Alright, so another reason you might want to can your meat is for easy meal preparation. I don't know about you, but my wife works, I work, my kid goes to school and works, and so a lot of times we come home in the evenings, we forgot to take something out to thaw to make for dinner. It takes forever for something to thaw out. The preparation is often a long time, especially if you're making stews or, say, a carne asada or anything that you have to braise for an extended period of time. And so a lot of times we'll just say forget it and either eat just a bowl of cereal sometimes or go out to eat. And so having meat that's already cooked, and it is already cooked in the jar, we'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a moment, but open up a jar, put it over pasta. I've jarred potatoes, some carrots. I can make a real quick stew, and in a fraction of the time have a fully cooked, home cooked meal. Because I can make a real quick soup. I can make a real quick stew. I can put it with potatoes, mashed potatoes, whatever whatever I'm feeling in the mood for. I can do that with pork, chicken, beef, whatever I have canned. I've canned duck, I've canned rabbit, I've canned venison, of course, pork butt. So I've got all kind of different things canned here, and so I can have a variety of meals real quick lunches, quick dinners. When you pressure can, the meat is actually cooking in its own juices. So I didn't add any liquid to this, and it's almost full of what looks like water. So the pressure canner increases the boiling point of water to 240 degrees. So 240 degrees for an hour and a half, essentially, with the pressure that we have, is creating a lot. I'm going to turn this down here. It's fully cooked when you get ready to use it. It's also very tender. You can take normally tough cuts, your neck meat, your shoulder meat. You can use some of the cuts that we talked about with the hindquarters. All of the things that you might normally just put in your sausage grind or your burger grind, you can put those in here, and it's going to like slow cooking it. So similar to putting it in a crock pot and letting it cook all day, this is just speeding up that process. So this is fully cooked. You can pull it out of here, pull it out of the jar, and make yourself a meal out of it, put it on bread, make a sandwich. Okay, so another benefit that I found is I'm more likely to use the meat that's in the can. I've got so many cuts. We talked about freezing the shoulders whole so that we can put them in a crock pot. I'll be honest, a lot of times I completely forget they're in there. We cleaned out our freezer yesterday, and down in the bottom of the deep freeze is meat from 2015, shoulders, things that got buried down in there. And so this allows me to make use of meat that I'm typically might forget about, might not ordinarily use. Okay, so another question that I had before I started is, do you cook the meat? The answer is you can. You don't have to cook the meat. As we talked about before, I put it in, I prefer the raw pack method. A lot of people will brown their meats and then put it in. Other people will fully cook. You can do fully cooked recipes and can them. Now the only things that you want to avoid are, you don't want anything that's going to expand. You don't want any kind of thickeners like flour or cornstarch in your recipe. You don't want uncooked beans that are going to absorb water and expand. Rice, pastas will fall apart. So you don't want any of that kind of thing. You also don't want to can anything with dairy. So cheeses, I have seen people can butter. I haven't got that brave yet, but sour cream, any of those things. But you can prepare a meal without those things, have a fully prepared recipe in a jar, empty it out, add your thickener, add your sour creams, add your dairy products after the fact, and you've got a great meal ready to go. Another common question is, do you need to sterilize your jars? If you are water bath canning, yes, you do need to sterilize your jars, your lids, everything. If you're pressure canning, it's going to get sterilized when it's in there. Again, it's in at 240 degrees for almost an hour and a half. And so there's really no need to sterilize your jars or your lids. Of course, you want to have them clean. Typically what I'll do is I'll take my jars, I'll put them in the dishwasher, wash them that way, and then I'll just take them out and I'm ready to can, and I don't worry about sterilizing them. Alright, so another question that people have is, I mentioned that I canned some rabbits, whole rabbits. I've canned some chicken with bone in. And so people want to know, can you can with bones? And the obvious answer is yes. Basically what you're doing is you're creating a very rich stock with the collagen and all of the goodness that comes from the meat and the bones. And so I actually prefer to can with the bone in if possible. I just feel like it gives me a richer flavor with the meat from the marrow and all of that kind of thing. So when I'm canning, I typically prefer to can bone in. You don't have to, but you can. Okay, we kind of covered it before. Do you need to add liquid? No, you don't have to add liquid to this method. To the raw pack method with meat. Now there are other things, like when I canned potatoes and I canned carrots, I added warm water on top of it, in part to get the air out, but also I wanted to have more liquid in it. Sometimes when you can, you'll have, in fact on this jar I have a little bit of meat sticking up, and it can kind of get an even more unappetizing grayish color to it. And so I've been tempted to add just a little bit of water, and probably in future batches I'll go ahead and add just a little bit of water. I don't want to add so much that it's going to spill out, and then that way I've got total coverage up to my headspace mark, or up to the lid. Okay, so another thing you may notice with this jar is there's a white ring around here, and what that is that's a fat layer. Normally I try to remove as much of the fat as I can, especially from venison. And the same thing when I canned the pork butts. I took the bottom layer of fat and just went ahead and kind of trimmed that off. You don't want too much fat, in part because really venison fat just doesn't have that great of flavor to it. But even with the pork fat, I went ahead and tried to remove as much as I could the external fat layer. I saved that for our sausage grind. But the other reason that you don't want too much fat, and so far I haven't had any issues, but that fat, again, when it pressurizes, it's going to release air out of your jars, and so you don't want that fat getting in those jars and affecting your seal, and that certainly can happen. So I try to remove as much of that fat layer as possible. Now obviously fatty meats like pork butts and that kind of thing, it's going to be impossible to do it. So you just need to make sure that you check your jars frequently. Jars have an indicator. Most of you are familiar with that. When a jar is open, that's going to it's going to make a little clicking sound. See, so it's got a popping sound when it's, that you're going to get with, you'll get that, and that means that you don't have a proper seal. The other thing is, when you open a jar, give it the smell test. If it smells bad, don't eat it. It shouldn't be a foul odor for sure. Alright, so we've got, given it 10 minutes, let that airflow out of there, and so I'm going to go ahead and drop my weight on there, and then this is a lock, and it's going to pop up here in just a second. You can see the steam is starting to escape out of there, and what it's going to do is it's going to pop up and lock. And then what we want to do is we want to wait for this dial, for the pressure on this dial to get to 10 pounds, about 11 pounds, and then we'll start our timer. We haven't started our timer yet for our 75 minutes in this case, 90 minutes if you're doing quartz. But once this reaches the 10 pounds, that's where you want to start your timer. And then you want to make sure you stay with it. Don't walk off and leave it. This becomes kind of a time bomb if you just let it go. Now with the cooker that I have, I don't think it's going to get that hot. But if I don't regulate it, it's going to get up to 15 pounds. And then this will start jiggling. For my level, above sea level, I want to make sure that it stays right around that 11 pound mark. And so I'll adjust my heat on my burner accordingly. So just make sure that you don't walk away from it, don't leave it. So we'll check back after this is done and we'll take a final look at it. Refer to your canning guide, refer to the canner that you have, refer to the National Center for Home Food Preservation. I think I said it wrong earlier. National Center for Home Food Preservation. Just kind of, refer to those resources. Okay, so I don't know if you can see the dial or not, but we've hit our 10 pound mark, so I'm going to actually back the heat off just a little bit. Let it sit around the 11 pound mark. I'm going to start my timer right now, and the important thing is, so we're gonna let that go for 75 minutes. The important thing is to make sure that you monitor this. If your pressure drops below the 11 pound mark or whatever it is for your area, then for safety purposes you're going to have to start that batch over. It is possible, but your meat's going to kind of start falling apart. The longer it stays in there, the mushier it's going to become. So you want to stay on top of it as best you can. So I'm not going to sit around for an hour and a half and wait for this to finish. I've showed you kind of the finished product, and I'll do a little bit of B-roll pulling the stuff out when we're done. So when our timer hits the 75-minute mark, all we're going to do is just turn the heat off and just let it sit there. We don't want to attempt to open the pressure canner just yet. We want to let it cool completely and release all of the pressure. There's an indicator on this pressure canner, and when it drops, that means it's safe to open. But just let it sit there for a little bit until you are 100% certain that the pressure is released. Now once that happens, you want to go ahead and open the canner and open the lid away from you, because there's still going to be a lot of steam built up in there, and you want to make sure you open the lid directly away from you. And go ahead and take your jars out, set them on a towel or a cooling rack of some sort. I typically take mine and put them on a cooling rack on top of a towel, and then just leave them alone for 24 hours. You don't want to let them cool all the way down in the canner, or you can get what's called flat sour. That's one thing that I learned over on TexasBowhunter.com from our good friend Rat, who's been canning for a long time. That pretty much is kind of the basics of canning meat. If you have any questions about canning meat or the process or the way that I do things, feel free to ask them. I'm certainly no expert on it. Like I say, I've done 4 or 5 batches, but I'll answer as many as I can. One of my goals for 2018 is I want to do more kind of cooking recipe, cooking videos, and so one of the things that I want to focus on is actually how to use this. There are a ton of videos on the internet about how to can meat, but there are very few that show you how to use the finished product, and so I want to make sure that I do that. I hope you'll subscribe so that you can be notified when we come up with a new video. Again, as always, appreciate you watching, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one.